load into today's session. We will get started momentarily. Good afternoon and welcome to today's very special event, looking back at 10 years since the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement entered into force on March 15th, 2012. We are delighted you could be with us here today. Before we get to today's event, a few short notes. Last week, we held a terrific event looking at the new sanctions put on Russia in response to their invasion of Ukraine. The video for that is now available on our website at www.wita.org. We'll hold a follow-up to that event on March 31st to look at the trade implications of the sanctions. We also had an event coming up on March 23rd in partnership with the Elliott School at George Washington University to look at reform of the WTO. You can also find information about those events on our website. Before we turn to today's guests, if you've attended any of our 119 webinars in the past 2 years, you know that we like to call out the names of people in our audience you're in community with on today's Zoom. So even if you can't see them on camera. So welcome today to Devi Keller at Texas Instruments, Roseanne Guerin at Radio Free Asia, Linda Forrester at the Pennsylvania Office of International Business Development, and Jack Shao at Hormel Foods. Welcome Devi, Roseanne, Linda, and Jack, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to some of those toward the end of our session if we have time. You should have also received an email with panelists' biographies, so we can dispense with lengthy introduction of our guests. It's a distinct pleasure, though, to welcome our very special guest, South Korea's Minister for Trade, Yeo Han-koo. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Minister. Following the minister's opening remarks, we'll hear from Ambassador Mark Lippert, the former United States ambassador to the Republic of Korea, and an expert panel including good friends of WITA, Nigel Corey with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Cleet Williams with Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and Maria Ziba with the National Pork Producers Council. Our discussion today is moderated by my dear friend and someone who I worked together with in the U.S. Senate several years ago, Deanna Tanner-Oken, the former chair of the U.S. International Trade Commission and managing partner at AMS Trade LLP. Deanna?
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure. I very much appreciate your invitation to me to moderate this distinguished group and for this very special WITA event on the 10th anniversary of the entry into force of Chorus, and I would say another anniversary, which is almost 15 years since I sat at the head of the ITC, listening to the testimony from many people in the industry as we evaluated the impact of Chorus on the U.S. economy. So it's a treat to be here, a treat to welcome this group, and with that, we will turn over the discussion, and we'll first, as you said, hear from Minister Yeo. Mr. Minister, we welcome your remarks.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with the Washington International Trade Association. Thank you to Ken for arranging for this gathering on this important topic and occasion. While I reserve most of my time for engaging with the distinguished panelists and answering questions from the WITA members online, I'll briefly share my thought on the Chorus Fta 10th anniversary. This morning, we had a very nice ceremony hosted by U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Korea's Chamber of Commerce with the participation of myself and also USTR Catherine Tai. Despite its rocky start, a 6-year process from the commencement of negotiations to enactment, Chorus boasted an enviable report card on its 10th anniversary. Now Korea is the world's 10th largest economy and 8th largest trading nation. The United States stands today as Korea's 2nd largest trading partner, and Korea is the 6th largest trading partner of the United States. Our bilateral trade volume grew by 70% from $100 billion right before the Chorus Fta to $170 billion by 2021. And our investment flow doubled and tripled in both directions. But more than anything, I'd like to emphasize that decade-long Chorus Fta was a game changer, which fundamentally transformed the nature of our Chorus partnership into an equal strategic partnership. Now Korea and United States are interconnected and indispensable key partners in critical supply chains such as semiconductors, batteries, electric vehicles, energy, biohealth, etc. Korean investment in the United States created nearly 90,000 quality local jobs through 2021, making substantial contribution to job creation efforts by leading Korean companies such as Hyundai, Kia, Samsung, LG, POSCO, Lotte, etc. In states such as Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, South Carolina, Louisiana, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, and so on and so forth. For example, electric vehicles and battery supply chains. There are 14 new battery factories being built in the United States by 2025, and 11 out of the 14 the factories are being built by Korean or Korea-US joint venture companies, comprising about 70% of new capacity being built in the United States. In semiconductors, for example, Samsung has decided to invest $17 billion to build a new semiconductor factory in Texas. Conversely, the chemical giant DuPont has contributed to diversification of sourcing for the Korean semiconductor industry with their investment in photoresist material production. So in fact, in semiconductor, without each other, the global supply chain wouldn't function at all. The US export to Korea state-of-the-art semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and Korea use the equipment to produce semiconductors and supply to the United States and around the world. Another example, biohealth. Last year, our two leaders agreed to establish Chorus Global Vaccine Partnership, combining competitive advantage each has to save the world from the pandemic. US is a world leader in innovative biotechnology, and Korea has world's second largest biopharm production capacity. Since then, life-saving Moderna vaccines with mRNA technology is being manufactured in Korea to be distributed and supplied around the world to save millions of people's lives. So now Korean businesses and investment dot the US map, solidifying our supply chain cooperation and contributing to the local economies and job creation. In fact, Ambassador Tai and I will make a road trip to Michigan tomorrow. Why Michigan? You may wonder. Let me take a moment to explain. We are visiting a factory of SK Siltron, a Korean-invested company that manufactures semiconductor components for electric vehicles in Auburn and Bay City. Ambassador Tai and I think that it best represents the alliance between our two countries and the future of our economic alliance. As the world faces chip shortages and therefore impacting Michigan's famous auto industry, the Korean company's operation in Michigan is a perfect example of bilateral supply chain cooperation when it comes to reinforcing the stability and resilience of both countries' semiconductor and electric vehicle supply chain. This is in large part due to the mutual trust both sides have developed over the past decade, working tirelessly to improve business conditions by streaming regulations and providing troubleshooting solutions. Moreover, at a time Michigan is reestablishing its leadership in electric vehicles, as we did with internal combustion engine more than a century ago. The partnership between Korean company and the US companies such as the GM and Ford is helping Michigan being transformed into a new center of electric vehicle manufacturing, thus ensuring stability and stable growth. The Korean company is producing chips to be used in electric vehicle for American companies, and the electric vehicles are being exported around the world. In particular, with high tech and climate change on everybody's mind as a future for industrialized countries, it is a great example of forward-looking partnership with job creation, clean, green technology. And American and Korean economies are playing to their strength in new state-of-the-art auto manufacturing and high tech. Let me just briefly touch on the future of Chorus Fta. Yes, now it's a high time to plan ahead the future of Chorus Fta for the next 10 years. In fact, last November, during the Chorus Joint Committee held jointly by myself and USR Catherine Tai in Seoul, Korea, we agreed to continue to develop the trade relationship in a future-oriented approach and initiating new enhanced channels of communication to effectively address emerging new trade issues such as supply chain resilience and emerging technologies, the digital ecosystem, and trade facilitation. In this vein, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that the US is currently developing as a new cooperation framework in the region serves as a good platform for our two countries to build on the successful experiences of the last 10 years of Chorus Fta and work together closely as an ironclad Korea-US alliance that shares the same fundamental values of democracy, market economy, and the rule of law. So I'm fully convinced that our bilateral economic partnership, deeply rooted in our Chorus Fta, will weather any storm and help our countries open a new chapter in trade investment cooperation. I'm looking forward to engaging in conversation and Q&A. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Those are really terrific remarks that highlighted the positive contributions, not just that flow out of Chorus, but that come from the very close relationship between the United States and the USR and the Republic of Korea. So appreciate the specific examples that you've provided, and I think our panelists will be able to talk about the experience of their industries as well. But I also appreciate that you looked ahead at what comes next, because that's an important part as well and part of our discussion, I hope, today. So with that, I would like to welcome the panelists to turn on their videos and join us online here. And each of our panelists is going to give some brief opening remarks, and then we will turn to our questions and answers, and hopefully we'll have many from the audience, and I have a few of my own. I'm going to start, Ambassador, with your remarks, please.
All right, thanks, and a real honor to be here. Initially, I think I was supposed to sort of give a speech right after the trade minister, but I can't possibly follow that act. And so I thought I would just do a couple of quick bullet points to intervene and try to wrap up in about 5 minutes, because I'm really interested in the discussion as well. Let me take a little bit of a broader view, a little bit more of a political, diplomatic view of this, because we have some real economic experts who are lined up right after me. First, I think it's worth remembering that it's a real accomplishment that this agreement ever got into force in the first place, in terms of the negotiators had very little time, there were very big gaps, and there were a lot of issues to cover at inception. And I think, true to the very best parts of the US-ROK alliance, it was accomplished, and it is now one of the world's leading trade agreements. Many call it the gold standard, and we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary. So that is a remarkable achievement. Second, we did already cover some of the economic benefits. The trade minister outlined those very effectively. There were real, tangible economic benefits that have accrued as a result of this relationship to both sides. Third, let me get a little more on the strategic side. There's no doubt this agreement offered a second strategic pillar to the US-ROK relationship. Traditionally, this relationship had been really security focused. And you look at the history of the relationship, and what was happening on the security side is that the Korean government was taking more control of the security matters. You had a reduction, basically, in the US role in terms of day-to-day defense of the peninsula. The US troop numbers were coming down. There were more the mechanisms called the SCM, MCM that were equal in partnership on the military and defense side. And in that context comes this second robust pillar on the economic and trade side that I think dovetails nicely with what the trade minister said in terms of befitting more of an equal partnership. And I think that was really a significant development in the relationship. It also, I think, led to enhancements of a third and fourth pillar of the relationship. First, in terms of what I call the new frontiers, the fourth industrial revolution, cyberspace, energy, environment, global health. Those, I think, really helped. Those elements were really accelerated on the back of the second economic pillar. So you had this third pillar of new frontiers coming in down the line. And finally, I do think it played, especially in terms of some of the IP protections, the investment accelerations, helping and enhancing the cultural connection between our two countries. I do think the popularity of K-pop, popularity of some of the K-dramas, I don't think it was entirely or even a majority a reason of the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, but I think there are kernels in there that were helped. So I do think not only did it provide a second pillar, it helped accelerate a third and a fourth pillar as well, and really helped round out the relationship to what the trade minister calls an equal partnership here today. Final couple of points here. I think the economic folks will get into this in greater detail, but just to call out the point that it did help set international economic trade agreement standards for the next 10 to 15 years to come. You know, as I mentioned, gold standard, but you can see the Chorus Fta replicated in other multilateral and bilateral agreements around the world. And I think it's also worth noting historically, I think Korea had one other FTA coming into the Chorus Fta agreement. I think it was with Chile. And after the Korean, US-Korea FTA, you look at all the proliferation of free trading agreements that Korea had, it helped bring Korea into the global trading system as the major actor it is today, working closely with the United States. All right, to wrap up, I think I'll just associate myself with the trade minister's points that it did set the stage for the next level of next generation of cooperation in terms of supply chain, the digital economy, biologics, climate, energy. There's little doubt it did that. And finally, in terms of the future, longer term, I think probably we're less into renegotiation territory. I think Cleet's going to cover that. I'm trying to set him up here. Less into renegotiation and more into building out the new sectors that the trade minister mentioned. I also think that there's important work to be done on regulatory harmonization. We can get into some of that. And finally, working with the United States together in multilateral trade and economic forums to essentially effectuate, establish, and strengthen a rules-based international order. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it's important on this anniversary for you to remind us of the good work that was done, not from the government officials on both sides, members of Congress, the industry who helped get this over the line, and I think many of them are in the audience and involved here. And I'd have to say there's probably going to be a paper out there on Chorus as the pillar for Squid Game. So thanks for reminding us about the cultural aspect as well. And you set Cleet up well to give his perspective because he really has, I think, the long view on this going forward. So Cleet, turn to you.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Chorus is near and dear to my heart. And, in one way or another, I've been involved with this agreement. I think I've played a role in the negotiation, the congressional passage, the implementation, 2 separate renegotiations, and here we are. And look, I don't want to totally sugarcoat it. I want to be honest and say it was tough. It was tough at times, sitting across the table from the Korean negotiators, who I will not lie, are some of the best in the world. Very, very worthy adversaries, you might say. But look, there were also moments, in the Trump administration that I was a part of where, I didn't think we'd get to 6 years, let alone 10. And there's a lot of focus on that. But I also think people need to step back and remember this wasn't easy in Korea either. And there were massive protests in the street. They did have I remember a stink bomb going off in their legislature while they were considering this. So, we've both struggled with this over time. But I'll tell you what, when I look back now, 10 years on, all those struggles, it was totally worth it. And I know that a lot of people today, there's fact sheets out there talking about how much our trade has exploded and the FDI, and that's all great. And really, I think is due to this agreement. But I think there's a qualitative element to our relationship that's even more important. And I'm, as I sit here in Washington, one of the things we're really focused on right now is critical supply chains. And you hear the administration focused on what are we going to do on semiconductors? What are we going to do on electric vehicles and batteries? And who our number one international partner on all these issues is? Many times it's Korea. And all these investments that are being made in each other's economy, I think are fantastic. And so there's this qualitative element to the partnership. And I'm really impressed with the way the Koreans have stepped up. I give the minister a lot of credit. The announcements today on trade, what they've done on export controls as it pertains to Russia. Again, I think that's another testament to how close we are. And then I also look at the leadership they've shown at the WTO. I don't think Korea gets enough credit for being one of the first and only countries to say, we're going to move on. We no longer need developing country status. We're a success story. We're going to be a model for the rest of the world to really try to galvanize the conversation there. So again, I think it's, a fantastic accomplishment. There's a couple problems we need to work on. I don't want to belabor them, but I will start with, I know the trade minister wants us to fix that steel problem. So, that's an issue we've got out there. And I think, from the perspective of the United States, there are still some issues in the Korean market. There is some concern about the trajectory on digital issues and whether or not there can be, discrimination against some of our content providers. I also do hear from, U.S. companies who are some of the largest investors in Korea that sometimes the administrative state seems like it's focused a little bit too much on them and undermining their, competitive edge. But look, we've been through a lot together. We can get through all these things, and I'm optimistic about the way forward. I won't belabor this either. I largely agree with what Ambassador Lippert said. I think we'll build on the chorus. Let's get Korea into the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where we can work on digital trade and we can work on these other issues. Let's further collaborate multilaterally, and whether it's reforming the WTO or thinking about a successor organization with our democratic partners. And then finally, let's solve the steel problem. These measures were put in place at a very different time when prices were not as high as they are now, and capacity utilization wasn't where it is now. And I hope we can find a solution that works for both countries. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Clete. Really helpful to hear your remarks, and again, kind of your long history in being involved with this and what you see as the challenges going ahead. And I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to talk about that a little more. We're next going to hear from Nigel who works with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Nigel, I was reflecting again, thinking that the ITC hearings were held June 20th of 2007. The iPhone had not launched on June 30th of 2007. So as we think about, digital trade and handling the issues of tomorrow, I think it's helpful to have the perspective on what Chorus got right on the information side, even though technology and all the changes that have come up. So look forward to your remarks.
No worries. Yeah. Thanks, Deanna. Thanks, Ken. It's great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. And in some ways, my focus, my specialty in focusing on data governance and digital trade really gets to the point of the potential promise for Chorus in terms of the next step, the next generation. Chorus was groundbreaking in its inclusion of language on data flows, albeit hortatory, so it wasn't binding. And so it was a step in the right direction. It certainly didn't set the standard more broadly following that from what we saw at the TPP and the CPTPP, and obviously what the US has done since then. And so I suppose symbolizes an area of work where the two sides really do need to sort of like take another look and to work on. And I mention that because the next generation of cooperation is going to be a lot of digital. And so it'd be best if both sides sort of reset what they're each doing to provide a steady foundation for the future. And as Cleet mentioned, it's somewhat problematic when working with Korea when there are some particularly problematic proposals there that sort of unfairly target US cloud and digital service providers. For example, Korea has public sector cloud service procurement rules that not only require cloud providers to physically set up a local data center, but that it be dedicated to just the public service, so no hybrid services. This is very restrictive and a requirement that no other developed country has in place in terms of having physical separation of data centers. There are also other concerns about Korean rules around licenses for US firms to be able to transfer location-based data outside the country, which obviously precludes Google and other firms from offering navigational and other mapping data services. This is despite the fact Korean mapping data is readily available outside Korea. And then there are also long-standing issues with payment services in Korea being forced to set up local data centers, and with there being restrictions on transfers of financial and reinsurance data. And so I suppose I nitpick and focus on that because it's important to get these sort of addressed and taken care of so that Korea can join the United States and other like-minded trading partners like Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, who are moving on in developing the next generation of trade agreements and mechanisms for cooperation on digital and technology policy, which are all foundationally based on sort of protecting and supporting the free flow of data, and given it's so key to how modern trade happens. And so we would obviously love to see Korea take these corrective steps to help its sort of Chorus upgrade, but then also to facilitate its involvement in the Biden administration's emerging Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which will obviously include a broad range of digital and tech policy issues that would itself allow Korea to sort of upgrade its digital strategy, its digital trade strategy with the region, and move on from some of the more sort of tactical agreements and decisions it's made in Korea joining APEC's cross-border privacy regime system. Korea has also obviously achieved an adequacy determination with the EU, but so a clean slate at home and a solid role in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework would be an opportunity for Korea and the United States, as well as our other partners in the region, to sort of bring the few issues together. The other major issue that I would just highlight that the minister pointed on in terms of the respective capabilities that both countries have as it relates to life sciences is that this is an area where there are still a few sort of niggling issues that sort of disadvantage US firms and products. But at least in terms of appropriately valuing innovative medicines. And so again, hoping this is something that the Korean government will be able to address. And it was good to see that there were media reports from late last year that the Korean government is considering reforms to its preferential drug pricing scheme that would essentially remove this barrier to what has otherwise been a really sort of productive and useful sector for collaboration. But with that, I'll end it there and look forward to the Q&A.
Oh, great, Nigel, thank you. And thank you for highlighting these issues, which are really on the cutting edge, the next steps that need to be taken in so many of these technologies and where innovation and trade intersect. So appreciate those and hope we get to cover that in our discussion. Next, we're going to hear from Maria with the National Pork Producers Council. Maria, I'll say I remember in almost every FTA report that the ITC did, agriculture was always a key issue and both a sticking point in negotiations, but also in evaluating the impact on such an important sector in the United States. So with that, we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, and thanks to WITA for inviting us to speak on this panel. Chorus has been hugely beneficial for the U.S. pork industry. We've seen a significant increase in exports to Korea since the implementation of the agreement and a steady rise in the U.S. shares of Korea's pork imports. In fact, now Korea is our 5th most important export market. And last year in 2021, we exported over $556 million in pork and pork products. But it's not just about pork. The overall U.S. agricultural exports have also steadily risen under Chorus, and in fact, over the last 10 years, we've seen a 54% increase in U.S. ag exports. So there are certainly areas that need improvement, but overall, it has been a very beneficial agreement for U.S. pork and agriculture in specific sectors in ag. So this isn't a surprise for anyone that has followed U.S. ag trade policy over the past 30 years. Free trade agreements have, as you mentioned earlier, it's been a pretty big success story for U.S. ag, and ag exports have increased following the implementation of every FTA that the United States has negotiated, including Chorus. The increase has been so significant that if you remove China from the equation, the U.S. now exports more to the 19 FTA partners than to the rest of the world combined. This is a very important to maintain that sort of momentum. That's why for us, it was, for the pork industry, it was such a tragedy that we, and for U.S. ag as a whole, when we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We like to negotiate new trade agreements, so it was certainly not welcome to withdraw from TPP. Had we stayed in that agreement, we would be seeing big gains in key markets like Vietnam, where we currently do not have an FTA. And moreover, we would be able to take advantage of the enhanced disciplines of regulatory barriers that were part of CPTPP and the CLEAT. And Nigel just mentioned on those standards, of obviously different sectors of the US economy, but still standard setting is very important for us. We know that Korea has expressed interest in joining CPTPP, and we're a little jealous of that, just because the US is obviously not in that position right now. For US pork producers, we are the most efficient in the world. Given open markets and a level playing field, we do very well in our export markets and we prosper. We appreciate the importance of the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I know that the Korean government has expressed interest just today. So we're really happy to see that, but ultimately it's no substitute for pork or any other sectors when negotiating FTAs. So that's why it's our top priority to negotiate and get back into CPTPP and have similar type of agreements like the one that we had with Chorus, which set a good baseline and example for us to continue our export trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And before we turn to questions from the audience, and I know Ken will be coming back on here, and I want to thank everyone for their remarks. I think it leaves us a number of issues that we can discuss. But Mr. Minister, I know that Ken, when he started, talked about the WITA program last week on sanctions against Russia for their invasion of Ukraine. And I wondered if you could share with us, I think it would be interesting to the audience to hear your government's position on sanctions against Russia.
Yes, thank you for the question. In fact, I was in Washington, D.C. About 2 weeks ago. I made a sudden trip because of this Russian, this export control measures. Basically, Korea has joined the United States and other allies in, putting this similar level of export control measures against Russia. And so we are completely aligned with the United States. And then we strongly condemn this inhumane and very unfortunate the tragedy happening in Ukraine. And also, I believe today or in Geneva time, also United States and Korea and other like-minded country issued a joint statement in the exploring concrete measures to restrict this multilateral trade benefit to Russia. So I think in many areas of sanction, such as the SWIFT, this restriction, export control measures, and many others, Korea is aligned with the United States.
Thank you for sharing those comments. Well, I wanted to, I think we have some questions for the audience, but maybe I'll start with one for the panel as a whole. And Mr. Ambassador, maybe I'll start with you. There were mentions to the other multilateral potential agreements out there, some where the U.S. is involved and some where they are not. In your view, would the priority be to focus on bilateral negotiations under Chorus, or to try to deal with some of these issues that the panelists have raised in a multilateral setting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, there's always a fine line between trade issues and commercial disputes. And as ambassador, you straddle that line each and every day, right? Bouncing between USTR, the Commerce Department, and the State Department. My general view is that most of these issues that are, I think there are serious issues out there. They're commercial issues that need to be resolved, usually within a bilateral framework. And I think the one interesting thing about being ambassador to Korea is that you can move the needle in the bilateral relationship on pretty tough disputes. It takes time. It takes a fair amount of energy, but you look at the track record of the U.S.-Korea relationship on economic and commercial issues, and generally speaking, there's a trend towards resolution. That is not to say we're at zero. That is not to say it's not difficult, and it is not to say that we would rather focus our time, attention, and energy elsewhere in this relationship, because every time you are caught up in these disputes, it's an opportunity cost to do other things more globally. So my general position on this is, look, we don't need a renegotiation of Chorus. Some of these issues, you can argue, fall just outside of Chorus. Others would argue it's inside Chorus, within the spirit of Chorus. I think, to me, it feels like we need to take that basket of issues, really focus our attention on reducing, winnowing, and resolving these issues, akin to my comments about perhaps some regulatory alignment that could come over time as Korea comes into some of these multilateral institutions, but generally is a bilateral issue. Then I think pivot, we can do both at the same time, but then while we're doing the bilateral commercial dispute resolution, move aggressively into partnering with the Koreans in the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, especially in key buckets there. And Cleet's very good comments about the WTO, as well as a partner there at the multilateral stage to strengthen rules-based international order. So that's it in a nutshell. Final point, I'll just get off the stage. This is kind of the all-day seminar, if you want it, but generally speaking, that's kind of my oversimplified version of it.
If I could jump in here, if okay. Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think Ambassador Lippert did a good job of outlining it. I can be a little more specific in some ways. I mean, I take steel as an example, right? This is a bilateral irritant. We're going to need to come up with a bilateral negotiated outcome. My perspective is that trying to come up with something similar to what the US has done with the EU, Japan, and hopefully very soon now with the UK. I think that would be a good model for Korea. I think it's a fair model for Korea, but it isn't the end of the story. I think then what you need to do, if we're going to solve these broader problems of excess capacity in the steel industry, if we're going to deal with the climate issues, and I was at the same chamber event as a lot of folks today, where there was a lot of discussion about some of the innovative ways in which Korean steel companies are working on steel making to make it more environmentally friendly. We need to then bring Korea into that broader international discussion about how to solve those problems. And so again, it really needs to be both bilateral and then more multilateralized. And that's just one example of it. But I think if you look at all these different issues, you could probably apply a similar paradigm. Digital. Let's solve some of the irritants we have together, and then let's look at making Korea part of the IPEF trade module, focusing on digital issues and setting global standards. So I would say both is absolutely the way to go.
Nigel, I see you shaking your head in violent agreement with that. But are there any specifics that you think have to be part of how you address that?
I think that definitely not mutually exclusive. And I think the trade minister and his colleagues recognize the need to, I think, move on some of these digital issues, as they're essentially a precondition for joining both the CPTPP and the Chile, Singapore, New Zealand Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And so they're obviously an irritant in a bilateral sense, but they're obviously a broader barrier to taking the type of steps that the minister and his colleagues have already signaled that they're interested in doing. And so I think there's the opportunity with these various sort of opportunities coming together to sort of like get on the same page, which provides a far stronger platform for Korea, the US, Japan, Singapore, and others to sort of broaden the scope of engagement on trade and technology issues in the region.
Maria, maybe I could ask you, you had also commented on feeling like we're sitting on the sidelines, but are there any issues that are affecting pork exports or and the sanitary issues that are better done bilaterally?
Well, Ambassador Catherine Tai this morning at the chamber event certainly mentioned one big sticking point, which was on the onerous biotech approvals process. So that's certainly something that can be worked out bilaterally. For us, we, when we first negotiated Chorus, a lot of those TRQs did come off, and we lowered the tariffs. So we've seen a lot of our exports increase significantly, 30%. And for the beef industry, it's been even a bigger win for them. But I'd say that when we negotiate these bilateral trade agreements, or when we're talking about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, rules-based systems and standard setting is very, very important. And when we can follow international science-based standards, that's really the best way to move forward. And it really is very beneficial for US Ag in general.
Mr. Minister, I know you've been taking careful notes on what our panelists have had to say. Is there, would you like to comment on this issue? I mean, obviously you mentioned that Korea is interested in further multilateral negotiations. Is there anything specific that you'd share with us in terms of how you think that it could move, broaden the relationship in a positive way?
Yes, thank you very much for a lot of very insightful, comments that the panelists share. I, agree with most of their remarks. Basically, yeah, I mean, the bilateral and multilateral can be done, in parallel. For example, Korea has, 22 FTAs with 59 countries, covering about 85% of global GDP. And then now we are also actively pursuing this more plurilateral or multilateral, such as CPTPP, and also when it comes to IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Korea is in a sort of a transitional period. We had the new president-elect a few days ago, but basically we welcome and this IPEF, and we consider this as a very positive development that we are welcoming the return of U.S. leadership into the region. Steel, digital, the pork, in more general, eggs, whatever the new issues emerging or coming up, I think what matters is that we have this framework to tackle whatever issues together. I mean, a transparent and mutually trusted manner. So I think that's what made this 10-year anniversary of Chorus possible. I think also on digital topic, Korea is prepared to enter into the CPTPP, and we have spent a lot of time analyzing and preparing ourselves for this CPTPP level of this e-commerce and digital chapter, and I think we are ready. And but there are some of new issues because the technology, the pace of the development of new technology, new business model, new platform is so fast that I think many countries are sort of exploring what would be the appropriate regulatory regime or governance structure. So in that sense, I think in addition to this bilateral engagement, trying this more plurilateral or multilateral, this rule setting, among like-minded countries would be very helpful. In that sense, we are very, looking forward to engaging further discussion with United States and other like-minded countries in developing this IPEF and any other forms of new, multilateral, the agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Minister, and it's such a unique opportunity to have you on the panel. I wonder if if the panelists have any questions they'd like to pose directly. If not, I have another question, but I wanted to give you all an opportunity to engage with the minister as well. All right, well, we'll let them continue to think of what they might want to ask you, but I wanted to, and I'm going to open this to the panel, which is to ask a question about China. Because I think even, Pleat, when you mentioned the 232 negotiations, I mean, the elephant in the room is China's overcapacity in steel and its contributions to overcapacity in the region. Is the Chorus or these multilateral agreements, are they going to be an avenue for us to address the question of China's intentions and how to deal with the repercussions of what they're doing that influence these bilateral trade issues, including in steel?
Yeah, so I can pick up this one first, and let me say, I think we need to be careful about how we articulate this, and I think Korea is probably similarly situated as a lot of countries in the region where they do a lot of business with the U.S. and they also do a lot of business with China, and so I do think that there's a delicate balance in sort of being seen as sort of only being willing to deal with one or the other. And I think we need to allow countries to straddle that. But I think there's a question of values. I think there's a question of model of doing business. I think there's a question of non-discrimination and openness and fairness. And I think we need to work very hard with countries like Korea who are willing to move in that direction and show leadership in that direction. And so I might not put it quite so explicitly because I think it actually may not work to the U.S. advantage. But I think if you look at it, if you take a step back and you just look at it from a value standpoint in a model of doing business, I think absolutely partnering with someone like Korea who is in that orbit is essential. And if I want to give one specific area, an area where I would like to see a lot more coordination between us is on export controls. And we'll see how that fits into the IPEF. Initially, there was like a separate module for export controls. Now my understanding is it may be folded into another one. But we have these debates in the U.S. about what do we need to do to protect our most sensitive technologies. And none of that stuff works if we try to do it unilaterally. We need other countries who are innovative leaders like Korea, especially in the semiconductor space, to be working with us. And at its core, that is a China issue. And I hope that sort of the progress we've made on Russia will be something we can utilize in that space. So again, I'm maybe I'm being a little bit too cute here, but what I'm trying to say is, like, absolutely, yes, we need to work on China, but I think we need to be careful about how we phrase it and how explicit we are, because I think that in some ways will make it tougher for certain countries to do so.
Yeah, and I want to turn back to that export control question, but Mr. Ambassador, I wonder, you've spent a lot of time in the region. How do you view the China question, how it plays into the bilateral relationship as we move forward with Korea?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess what I would say is, I don't think, let me come back to just the Korean elections quickly, in that I don't think the election turned on foreign policy in this election. It was largely about unity of parties and domestic issues. But having said that, there was, and I think it's a little overstated, there was a difference likely emerging on outward look of foreign policy in terms of how Korea would fit into the Biden administration coalition-based diplomacy in and around the Asia-Pacific, including the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Quad. And I think the consensus among Korea watchers is that the conservatives, who ultimately won the election by less than 1%, are more inclined in terms of integration with the US-led efforts, as I mentioned, the Indo-Pacific region, the Quad, so on and so forth. So they tend to be a little more, at least on the foreign policy side, a little more internationalist in disposition, whereas I think the progressives are a little more inward-looking, focused, a lot of focus on the North Korea question. And I do think that that will probably make for an easier conversation between Washington and Seoul on a lot of these issues that I just mentioned. Final point, though, I don't want to overstate it, because I think you had at the top of the progressive national security advisor structure, people like Wee Sung-lak, who people in this town know well, a very experienced hand in terms of the US ROK relations. So it wasn't a 1 or a 0, but I do think that there's more inclination now, likely more inclination towards integration to Biden administration-led efforts in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thanks. I appreciate that observation from your perspective. And I see Ken has come back on the screen. He either has a question or is trying to wrap this up. So we'll see.
We're hitting the home stretch. We only have a few minutes left. And there were a couple questions still. So the panel did a great job of covering a lot of the discussion points that were raised in the Q&A, a lot of which had to do with the CPTPP related issues, but one that direct to Maria and then maybe come back to Cleet and then ask the minister for any closing comments. Maria, obviously there were provisions related to pork in the original Chorus. There was Chorus 2.0 in 2018. There is a CPTPP sitting out there that the U.S. isn't part of, but I know you expressed an interest in getting back to that. There is the Indo-Pacific Framework that's in the works. What is it that pork is looking for from not just Korea, but across the region that you would want to see incorporated in an Indo-Pacific agreement?
Well, in the long run, I think for not just pork, but for all of ag, it is very important to lower the tariffs and to have better access into some of these key markets. And we've seen some of that where temporarily Vietnam has reduced tariffs into that market, and the MFN duty, our exports increased tremendously. I think that that's first and foremost where we would love to see that being part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is for it to go beyond standard setting and go into a little bit more of that market access request that ag is so desperately in need of. But it's also very important to work on sanitary and phytosanitary issues that we continue to have across the globe and specifically in that region. And when we do that, we have to absolutely follow international regs and rules, and also be aware that the United States has some of the most onerous science-based technology and rules. So those are, I think, would be my top three.
Thank you. That's helpful. Cleet, one of the questions that came in, you, I guess, talked about a potential successor to the WTO based more specifically around a liberal and rules-based world order. The president has his alliance of democracies that he's talked about. What do you think that would look like, and what role do you see Korea playing? Korea specifically, and the lessons of the Chorus negotiations.
Yeah. No, look, it's a great question. I'm going to answer it in 1 second. But first, I want to quickly associate myself with Maria's remarks about market access, because I do think the lack of market access in IPEF is going to be a significant flaw in that agreement if it doesn't get fixed. And I also think it'll be an impediment to attracting support from countries in the region. So hopefully they can address that. But moving on to this question, look, my point was this. I think we all have to be realistic in looking at the WTO and say it has not been very effective at reaching agreements and updating and modernizing itself. And I look at Korea as sort of a rare example of a country who has basically said, you know, we are going to do something that in some ways maybe is not in our immediate national interests, in terms of saying we're no longer going to classify as a developing country. And we're no longer going to try to take advantage of what that means. Saying, look, there's a future, and and if we are going to actually have negotiated outcomes here, we need to show that kind of leadership. And I think more of that. I was hoping after Korea made the move, a whole bunch of others would fall in line, and we had 2 or 3 others who did the same thing, and they deserve credit too. Countries like Singapore, but like it does seem like the WTO is stuck. And so my point is, if that is the world we're in, we need to figure out what's another way to modernize the international rule set in the same way that Chorus did many years ago, the same way the WTO did many years ago. What do we do next? And I agree with Ambassador Lippert. Like, I don't want to renegotiate Chorus. We've already been there. But we should look at, is there some sort of broader set of negotiations that Korea and its creativity and its boldness is willing to be a part of? And I don't know if that's like an annex to the WTO through plurilaterals, or that's a completely successor institution. But I think we're at that point in time where we need to have that honest conversation. And I'm not sure whether sort of the Summit of Democracies is really getting there yet. But I think if we want to keep moving, liberalized trade forward, we need to be open-minded and realize it may be time to look at things that would have seemed crazy a few years ago, and take a realistic look at it. And like I said, Korea needs to be a part of that for many reasons.
Thank you, Cleet. And I will point out the fact that the renegotiated NAFTA had a minimum wage provision in a trade agreement was something people would have thought was crazy 5 years ago, let alone 15 or 20 years ago. Ambassador Lippert and Minister Yeo, I'm going to go to you two for the final closing remarks. Mark, do you have any final words, and then we'll ask Minister Yeo to give us his final remarks.
Just to say, look, it's for all of the issues, for all of the complexities we discussed here today, it's a real, I think it's important to take a step back, recognize all that's been accomplished by many people who are on this panel, but also who are attending this session as well. I mean, it is a remarkable piece of business, Chorus Fta, and sometimes we can get lost in the disputes. These disputes are very important. They keep ambassadors gainfully employed, I will say, in Seoul. But I will also say, big picture, really important stuff, really important to commemorate this 10th anniversary, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mr. Ambassador. Minister Yeo.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating discussion, a lot of insight and inspiration, and really energized myself. I think that, this Chorus Fta is, from the US perspective, it's the second largest FTA to United States. Of course, after the NAFTA, but this USMCA is your neighboring countries, and Korea is a country, an ocean away. And I was struck by the President Obama's statement when this Chorus Fta was concluded. He, stated that to the U.S., this Chorus Fta is bigger than the previous 9 FTAs combined. So I think the fact that this, this FTA of this size has, continued to develop and then operated, implemented for the last 10 years to a great success of to both sides. I think that's a great accomplishment, and especially these days we are facing this this tumultuous and gloomy news every day from this Eastern Europe, but having this kind of joyful conversation, celebrating this free trade and then mutually beneficial this trade pact with this distinguished expert in WITA was a really great honor and pleasure to me and our Korean trade community. Just going forward, I think we have a lot to do together. I mean, Korea and United States are really value-driven, market economy and democratic countries. And in Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, we have a lot of new challenges in global trade environment. All these the supply chain, digital, and decarbonization, etc. So I think based on, building on what we have accomplished through Chorus Fta for 10 years, I think we can join forces and really do a great, the job together for the greater Indo-Pacific area. So with that, I'd like to really appreciate the WITA for organizing this wonderful event, and like to thank Dina for excellent this chair of today's the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Deanna, thank you. Any final words, Deanna?
No, I share the minister's enthusiasm and optimism, and it was a great reminder of the importance and size of our relationship. So thank you, and thank you to all the panelists and to WITA for another great event. Really
thank you all very much. And Mr. Minister, WITA works frequently with KITA, the Korea International Trade Association, who has been a great partner with us on many things over the years. So we're very grateful to you, your colleagues at the ministry, for working with us on today's event, for our friends at KITA, for their friendship and support as well. Ambassador Lippert, Cleet, Maria, Nigel, Deanna, Minister Yeo, thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to have had you on the WITA platform. Hope you all take care of yourselves, be well, and we'll see you soon.